Greetings and welcome back to the Wild Swans at Coole. We are back again with the beginning theory series, and today's discussion is feminist criticism. The women's movement of the 1960s was not the start of feminism. Rather, it was a renewal of an old tradition of thought and action. So 1960s women movement was basically a realization of the fact that how women are presented in literature. Toril Moy explains that there are three terms according to the conditioning and socialization. These three terms are feminist, female and feminine. Feminist is a political position, female is a matter of biology, and feminine is a set of culturally defined characteristics. Now, what is socialization? Socialization and conditionings based on these two terms, Toril Moy differentiate that three terms. Socialization is the representation of women in literature. In 19th century fiction, very few women work for a living unless they are driven to it by dire necessity. Instead, the focus of interest is on the heroine's choice of marriage partner, which will decide her ultimate social position and exclusively determine her happiness and fulfillment in life or her lack of these. And this can be seen in Jane Austen's novel, for example, Pride and Prejudice. Thus, in feminist criticism in the 1970s, the major effort went into exposing what might be called the mechanisms of patriarchy, that is, the cultural mindset in men and women, which perpetuated sexual inequality. So basically, there are different kind of movement in different age of feminism. So it says that feminism is not a singular movement, rather it is feminisms. Feminism with S, that is, feminism has various kind of approach. In 1960s, the feminist or focuses on the images of women, how women are represented in literature. In 70s, that effort went into understanding or exposing the mechanism of patriarchy. Now, some of the 1970s feminists are Ellen Showalter. Ellen Showalter points out the 1970s change from books by men to books by women, which is androtext to gynotext. Showalter points out the term gynocritique. So there are three phases in the history of women's writing in 1970s, which is feminine phase, then there is feminist phase, and there is female phase. Feminine phase is women's writers imitate male writers. Feminist phase is women writers separate themselves from male writers and radically. And the third phase is female phase, where female writes their own story and their own experiences. Then comes in the 1980s. In the 1980s, feminist criticism attracted attention from Marxism, structuralism, linguistics. So we can see in the 60s, it was the feminism. So feminism begins not as a movement, but it was actually a renewal of an old tradition of thought and action. So in the 1960s, the focus goes on. The focus was not as if the term feminism, but it was like a women's movement. So what it focuses on the images of women promulgated by literature. Now in the 70s, this transformed to the exposed of patriarchy, the ideas of patriarchies. Then in the 80s, it attracted attention from Marxism, structuralism, linguistics. From attacking male versions of the world to explore the nature of the female world and outlook and the reconstruction of the lost or suppressed records of female experience. Then in the 80s, here also come the construction of a new canon of women's writing, where neglected women writers were given prominence. So in the 1980s, there were many women writers, but they were never the part of canon. Canon, what is canon? Canon is a group of writers or books who are very famous. But with the 1980s feminist movement, we are able to locate some of the women writers who are being neglected. Since the 1970s, feminist criticism has 3 areas: feminist criticism and the role of theory. Number 2, feminist criticism and the nature of language. And number 3, feminist criticism and psychoanalysis. So from 1970s, feminist criticism focuses on 3 areas: role of theory, nature of language, and psychoanalysis. Now, what is feminist criticism and the role of theory? There are Anglo-American versions of feminism. There is English feminist criticism. There are French feminism. What is Anglo-American version of feminism? It begins in the late 1970s. It focuses on literature as a series of representations of women's lives and experiences which can be measured against reality. Some of the critics are Ellen Showalter, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gover, Patricia Stubbs and Rachel Brownstein. So they and their writings, their work focuses on how literature is represented against reality, or how women are represented in literature against reality. Now comes in the mid 1980s, we have English feminist criticism. It has relation with cultural materialism or Marxism or socialist feminist. Examples are, there are groups like Marxist Feminist Literature Collective, there are Literature Teaching Politics Collective, and one of the feminists of this time is Catherine Belsey. Now comes French feminism. French feminism deal with concerns other than literature. Literary texts never primarily a representation of reality or never represented in the personal experience. It is about language representation and psychology. So French feminists focus on language representation and psychology, and some of them are Julia Kristeva, Helen Six. Then comes feminist criticism and the nature of language. There is a long-standing debate if there is a form of language which is feminine. Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, suggests that language use is gendered, so that when a woman turns to novel writing, she finds that there is no common sentence ready for her use. Dale Spender, in Man-Made Language, argues that language is not a neutral medium, but one which contains many features which reflect its role as the instrument through which patriarchy finds expression. So we can see that language is also affected by patriarchy. So here comes the invention or the idea of écriture féminine. Now what is écriture féminine? It is the storm that came into existence with the French theorist. It is associated with feminine and facilitating the free play of meanings within the framework of loosened grammatical structure. It is by its nature transgressive, rule transcending, intoxicated. Julia Kristeva is one of them. Julia Kristeva writes about symbolic and semiotic. These are the two concepts, two different aspects of language. So Kristeva points out that symbolic is the orderly surface realm of strict distinctions and laid down structure through which language works. So the language question is the most important areas of feminist criticism. The relationship of feminism and psychoanalysis comes with Kate Millett's Sexual Politics against Freud, and then Juliet Mitchell defends Freud. Mitchell says that sex and gender, the former being a matter of biology, the latter a construct, something learned or acquired, rather than natural. So Mitchell argues that gender is not natural. This distinction is what Simone de Beauvoir invokes in the famous book The Second Sex, where she writes, "One is not born a woman, rather one becomes a woman." Mitchell argues that Freud does not present the feminine as given and natural, but female sexuality is formed by early experiences and adjustments. Thus the argument runs, the nation of penis envy need not be taken simply concerning the male physical organ itself, but as concerning the organ as an emblem of social power and the advantages which go with it. For example, there was an advertisement where it is showed that a photograph of a nude woman with the caption, "What women need to succeed in a man's world." The woman was shown had male sexual organs drawn over her own body. Now, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober use the idea of social castration. It signifies women's lack of social power, this lack being represented by means of the word castration as a male possession, though not as in any sense a male attribute. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober in the book The Mad Women in the Attic points out that what Catherine or any girl must learn is that she does not know her own name and therefore cannot know either who she is or whom she is destined to be. This process is described as social castration by Sandra and Susan. They read the events of the novel Wuthering Heights as emblems of the construction of gender identity. Jane Gallup's book Feminism and Psychoanalysis talks about psychoanalysis but from a Lacanian point of view. The phallus is not the physical biological object but a symbol of power. Jacqueline Rose, The Hunting of Sylvia Plath is also an example of an applied feminist psychoanalytic approach. She combines feminism, psychoanalysis and politics. The argument shows sexual identity as cultural construct. So here we can see that 1960s feminism was basically a women's movement which focuses on how women are represented in literature. In the 70s it exposed the ideas of male patriarchy. In the 80s it was more of a psychological experience. Then since the 1970s all of the feminist movements that came there were focuses three main points: role of theory, then role of language and then psychoanalysis. In the role of theory, we have various feminist movement, for example, Anglo-American feminism, French feminism, English feminism. In Anglo-American feminism, we have Sandra Gilbert, Susan Goober. In English, we have Catherine Belsey or some of the groups like Marxist Feminist Literature Collective and then Literature Teaching Politics Collective. Then in the French we have Hélène Cixous, Julia Kristeva, and then in the language section we have Virginia Woolf, the important term écriture féminine, and then in psychoanalysis we have Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober, Simone de Beauvoir, Jacqueline Rose, Java feminist critics. So they rethink the canon as from the 1980s. They revalue women's experience. They examine representations of women in literature. It is in the 1960s movement. They challenge the idea of women and as other or gender as socially constructed, the role of language or the écriture féminine, then the power relations of literature with patriarchy, which is in the 70s movement, and then rereading psychoanalysis to explore the issue of female and male identity. Now here comes the important term which is anti-essentialism. So the contrary view that there is some natural given essence of the feminine, as patriarchy tried to make female, tries to show femininity or female as something anti-essentialism, but this is actually a hidden agenda of patriarchy that feminists point out that actually with the term feminine there is nothing called anti-essentialism. It is actually essentialism which they present as anti-essential through by saying that gender is something natural, which is wrong, which feminist says that gender is actually culturally constructed. So if you have liked this video, please make sure to like, share and subscribe with your friends.